The crimson sun broke through the misty horizon of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813, painting the still waters in shades of blood and gold. Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry stood on the deck of his flagship, the United States ship Lawrence, his weathered hands gripping the rail as his eyes swept across the tranquil lake. At 27 years of age, this Rhode Island native carried the weight of American hopes on his shoulders, knowing that the coming hours would determine not just the fate of the Great Lakes, but the very future of the young republic's northern frontier. The previous months had been a crucible of preparation and anticipation. Perry had arrived at Presque Isle in March, tasked with building and commanding a fleet that could challenge British naval supremacy. On Lake Erie, the shipyards of Erie, Pennsylvania, had echoed with the sounds of hammers and saws as American craftsmen worked tirelessly to construct vessels that would rival the British squadron. Commanded by Captain Robert Heriot Barclay, the Lawrence, named after the fallen hero Captain James Lawrence, whose dying words "Don't give up the ship," had become the battle cry of the American Navy, represented the pinnacle of American naval engineering on the lake's dot. As Perry surveyed his fleet, he could see 8 other vessels preparing for what would surely be their greatest test. The United States ship Niagara, sister ship to the Lawrence and commanded by Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott, rode at anchor nearby, her guns gleaming in the morning light. The smaller vessels, the Caledonia, Ariel, Scorpion, Summers, Porcupine, Tigress, and Trip, though individually less formidable, would play crucial roles in the coming engagement. Each ship carried within its hull not just cannons and ammunition, but the dreams and determination of a nation fighting for its independence and dignity. The British fleet, under the command of Captain Robert Heriot Barclay, had been spotted. The previous evening, 6 vessels strong, led by His Majesty's ship Detroit. They represented the Royal Navy's attempt to maintain control over the strategic waters of Lake Erie. Barclay, a veteran officer who had lost an arm in service to the Crown, commanded respect even among his American adversaries. His flagship Detroit, newly constructed at Amherstburg, was designed to match the firepower of Perry's largest vessels. Alongside her sailed the Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, Hunter, Chippeway, and Little Belt, a formidable squadron that had patrolled these waters with confidence and authority. The strategic importance of Lake Erie could not be overstated. Control of the lake meant control of supply lines between the eastern and western theaters of the War of 1812. British dominance of these waters had enabled them to support their Native American allies and maintain their positions. In the Northwest Territory, American success would sever these supply lines, potentially forcing British withdrawal from Detroit and opening the path for American advancement into Canada. The battle that lay ahead would determine whether the United States could truly claim sovereignty over its own inland seas. Perry's crew was a mixture of regular Navy sailors, militia volunteers, and soldiers borrowed from General William Henry Harrison's Army of the Northwest. Many were inexperienced in naval warfare, but their courage and determination burned as brightly as any veteran sailors. As the morning mist began to lift from the lake's surface, revealing the British fleet in the distance, Perry knew that history was about to be written on these waters. The young Commodore gathered his officers for final instructions, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Today, the American flag would either rise triumphant over Lake Erie or sink beneath its waves in defeat. At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, the lookout's cry shattered the dawn tranquility. Enemy vessels in sight. From his position in the crow's nest, the sailor could see 6 British warships emerging from the morning haze, their white sails catching the early light like ghosts materializing from the mist. Perry immediately raised his spyglass, studying the approaching formation with the practiced eye of a seasoned naval commander. The British fleet, having weighed anchor from their base near Amherstburg, was sailing in line-ahead formation, their long guns gleaming ominously in the sunrise. Captain Robert Heriot Barclay, aboard His Majesty's ship Detroit, had made his decision. During the night, with supply lines from the east increasingly threatened by American control of Lake Ontario, and his squadron facing shortages of both provisions and experienced sailors, he could no longer afford to wait. The newly constructed Detroit, though powerful, had been rushed to completion with whatever materials could be found. Her guns were a motley collection of various calibers, and many of her crew were soldiers pressed into naval service rather than trained seamen. Yet Barclay knew that decisive action was required. The American fleet at Put-in-Bay represented a growing threat that could no longer be ignored. Perry's response was immediate and decisive. "Signal the fleet," he commanded his signal officer. "Prepare for battle and follow my movements." The American ships began the complex process of weighing anchor and forming battle line. The Lawrence would lead, followed by the Ariel, Scorpion, Caledonia, Niagara, Somers, Porcupine, Tigris, and Trip, as per naval tradition. Perry ordered his battle flag raised, a blue banner bearing the immortal words of Captain Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship." The message was clear to every American sailor who could see it fluttering in the morning breeze. The wind conditions on this fateful morning would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. A light breeze from the southwest favored the British fleet initially, allowing them to maintain their preferred long-range engagement distance. Barclay's strategy was sound. His ships carried longer-range guns that could inflict damage, while staying beyond the reach of the American shorter-range, but more powerful carronades. The Detroit mounted 19 guns of various sizes, while the Queen Charlotte carried 17, together with their smaller consorts. The British squadron could deliver a withering barrage at extended range. Perry understood the tactical disadvantage, but also recognized an opportunity. His ships, particularly the Lawrence and Niagara, carried 32-pound carronades, devastating weapons at close range that could smash through enemy hulls with tremendous force. The challenge would be closing the distance while weathering. The British long-range fire, as recorded in the official naval records of the time. Perry's fleet possessed superior firepower overall, but only if they could bring their short-range guns to bear effectively. The two fleets began their deadly dance across the waters of Lake Erie, each commander seeking the advantage of wind and position. British confidence ran high initially. They had dominated these waters for months, and their experience in lake warfare was considerable. American determination, however, burned just as fiercely. Sailors who had never seen naval combat checked their weapons and prepared for the fight of their lives. Officers moved among the gun crews, offering words of encouragement and ensuring that every man understood his duty. The stage was set for what would become one of the most significant naval engagements in American history, a battle that would echo through the ages as a testament to courage, determination, and the price of freedom on the waters of the Great Lakes. At 11:45 in the morning, the stillness of Lake Erie exploded into chaos as the first British guns opened fire. The Detroit's long 18-pounders sent iron balls screaming across the water toward the approaching American line, their deep-throated roar echoing across the lake like thunder from a clear sky. Captain Barclay had chosen his moment well. The range was perfect for his long guns, while the American carronades remained impotently silent, their targets still beyond effective reach. The opening salvos sent towering waterspouts erupting around the Lawrence as British gunners found their range with practiced precision. Perry's response demonstrated both courage and tactical acumen, rather than maintain the traditional line of battle at long range where his ships would be systematically destroyed. He ordered the Lawrence to sail directly toward the British fleet, accepting punishment in order to close the distance. "We must get among them," he shouted to his officers. Over the increasing din of cannon fire, the Lawrence's hull shuddered as British shot found its mark, but Perry pressed forward, his jaw set with determination. Behind him, the American line began to falter as some captains hesitated to follow their commodore into what appeared to be certain destruction. The battle's intensity escalated dramatically as the range closed to effective carronade distance. When the Lawrence finally unleashed her 32-pound guns, the effect was devastating. The British ships Detroit and Queen Charlotte, caught in the concentrated fire of American short-range weapons, began to suffer grievous damage. Hull timbers splintered, rigging collapsed, and screams of wounded men mingled with the roar of guns. The water between the fleets turned white with foam as cannon balls churned the surface, while the air filled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the splintering crash of wood under fire. as detailed in historical accounts from the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command. Perry's flagship bore the brunt of British attention as she led the American charge. The Lawrence found herself engaged against multiple British vessels simultaneously, her crew fighting with desperate valor as their ship was systematically reduced to a floating wreck. Gun after gun fell silent as British shots swept her decks, killing or wounding the crews. Perry himself moved constantly about his ship, encouraging his men, helping to serve the guns, and refusing to seek shelter despite the carnage around him. His blue battle flag, riddled with holes but still flying, became a symbol of American determination. The turning point came when Perry realized that several of his other ships, particularly the Niagara under Lieutenant Elliott, had not fully engaged the enemy, whether through misunderstanding of signals, tactical caution, or the confusion of battle. Much of the American fleet remained at longer range, unable to bring their full firepower to bear. The Lawrence, meanwhile, was being pounded to pieces. Of her crew of 103 men, 83 had been killed or wounded. Most of her guns were silent, her masts were shattered, and her hull was barely afloat. It was then that Perry made one of the most audacious decisions in naval history. Gathering his battle flag and a small boat crew, Perry prepared to transfer his command to the relatively undamaged Niagara as British guns continued to thunder around him. The young Commodore climbed down into a small boat and rowed through the chaos of battle toward his sister ship. Enemy fire bracketed the small craft, sending waterspouts high into the air, but Perry's boat emerged from the smoke and spray to reach the Niagara safely. Climbing aboard, he immediately took command and prepared to turn the tide of battle. The sight of their Commodore's battle flag being raised aboard the Niagara sent a surge of renewed hope through the American fleet, while the British, seeing the Lawrence apparently surrender, believed victory was within their grasp. Perry's transfer to the Niagara marked the battle's dramatic turning point, though neither fleet yet realized how completely the tide was about to change. As the 27-year-old Commodore hauled down Lieutenant Elliott's signals and raised his own battle flag on the fresh ship, he quickly assessed the tactical situation with the sharp eye of a born naval strategist. The Niagara, having stayed largely out of the heaviest fighting, retained most of her firepower and crew, while the British fleet, particularly the Detroit and Queen Charlotte, had suffered extensive damage from their prolonged engagement with the Lawrence. This was Perry's moment, and he seized it with both hands. The wind, which had favored the British at the battle's opening, began to shift in a crucial development that would alter naval history. The breeze back to the southeast, giving the Americans the weather gauge and allowing Perry to dictate the terms of engagement. With practiced seamanship, he ordered the Niagara to wear ship and sail directly through the British line, a maneuver that would bring his powerful carronades to bear on multiple enemy vessels. Simultaneously, this bold tactical decision, essentially a naval cavalry charge, required both courage and precise execution under fire, qualities that Perry possessed in abundance. As the Niagara surged forward under full sail, her gun crews prepared for the devastating broadside that would decide the battle's outcome. The British fleet, stretched in line formation and many ships already damaged, could not concentrate their fire effectively against this new threat. Captain Barclay, severely wounded aboard the Detroit and having lost several key officers, watched in growing alarm as the fresh American ship bore down on his squadron. The Queen Charlotte, attempting to support the flagship, had become entangled with the Detroit. Their rigging fouled together in the heat of battle, leaving both ships vulnerable to Perry's approaching assault. The moment of impact came with thunderous violence as the Niagara broke through the British line, her guns firing in sequence as they bore upon each enemy vessel in turn. The concentrated firepower of her 32-pound carronades at point-blank range proved devastating to the already weakened British ships. The Detroit's mainmast crashed to the deck in a tangle of canvas and rigging, while the Queen Charlotte's hull was pierced repeatedly below the waterline. In the space of 15 minutes, Perry's bold maneuver transformed what had appeared to be British victory into American triumph. The psychological effect of Perry's charge was as important as its physical damage. Seeing their Commodore's battle flag flying from a new ship and watching the Niagara's devastating attack. The other American vessels finally pressed home their assault with renewed vigor. The smaller ships Ariel, Scorpion, and others closed to effective range and began pouring fire into the British line. British morale, already shaken by the loss of many officers, and the damage to their principal ships, began to crumble under this coordinated American attack. Captain Barclay, bleeding from multiple wounds, realized that further resistance would only result in unnecessary slaughter of his remaining crew. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the unthinkable happened. A British naval squadron struck its colors in surrender. The Detroit, Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, Hunter, Chippewa, and Little Belt, one by one, hauled down their ensigns in acknowledgement of defeat. For the first time in the Royal Navy's storied history, an entire British squadron had surrendered to an enemy fleet in open battle. Perry, standing on the Niagara's quarterdeck with his battle flag snapping proudly in the afternoon breeze, had achieved something that even the greatest naval commanders of his era had thought impossible. The waters of Lake Erie, which had run red with blood throughout the long afternoon, now reflected the colors of American victory in their gently lapping waves. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, an eerie silence descended over Lake Erie, broken only by the creaking of damaged rigging and the groans of wounded men. The acrid smoke of gunpowder began to clear, revealing the full extent of destruction wrought by nearly 4 hours of intense naval combat. Perry, standing amid the carnage on the Niagara's deck, felt the weight of victory settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. His first thoughts were not of glory, but of the human cost of triumph. American and British sailors alike lay scattered across blood-stained decks, their sacrifice having purchased this momentous victory. The formal surrender ceremony unfolded with the dignity befitting naval tradition, even amid the devastation of battle. Captain Robert Heriot Barclay, pale from loss of blood and supported by his remaining officers, was brought aboard the Niagara to present his sword to the American Commodore. Perry, displaying the magnanimity that marked great commanders throughout history, refused to accept Barclay's sword, recognizing the British captain's courage and the gallant fight his squadron had waged against overwhelming odds. This gesture of respect between enemies would become one of the war's most remembered moments of chivalry. Perry's immediate priorities following the surrender demonstrated his capabilities as both warrior and administrator. He ordered his surgeon to treat British wounded with the same care as American casualties, ensuring that enemy prisoners received food, water, and medical attention despite the strain on his own limited resources. The damaged Lawrence, though barely afloat, was secured alongside the Niagara for emergency repairs. Prize crews were placed aboard the captured British vessels, and the complex task of organizing the fleet for the return journey to Put-in-Bay began under the afternoon sun. As the immediate crisis of battle management subsided, Perry turned to, perhaps his most important task, informing General William Henry Harrison and the American government of this unprecedented victory. Finding a makeshift writing surface aboard the battle-damaged Niagara, the young Commodore composed what would become one of the most famous dispatches in American military history. In his clear, precise handwriting, he penned the immortal words, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours, 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." The message's brevity belied its monumental significance. For the first time in the War of 1812, American forces had achieved complete naval supremacy on one of the Great Lakes. The strategic implications of Perry's victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. British control of Lake Erie had been the linchpin of their entire defensive strategy. In the Northwest Territory, with their fleet destroyed and captured, British forces at Detroit and other frontier posts were cut off from supplies and reinforcements from the east. General Isaac Brock's carefully constructed alliance with Native American tribes would crumble without British naval support to maintain supply lines and provide the materiel necessary for continued resistance. Perry's triumph had effectively opened the entire Northwest Territory to American advancement and would lead directly to the recapture of Detroit and the decisive Battle of the Thames. The news of Lake Erie's conquest spread across the young nation like wildfire, providing a desperately needed morale boost to American forces and civilians alike. The war had not gone well for the United States in its early phases. The burning of Washington, the failed invasions of Canada, and numerous defeats on land and sea had left many Americans questioning their nation's ability to defend itself against the British Empire. Perry's victory demonstrated that American naval forces could not only compete with the legendary Royal Navy, but could actually defeat them in decisive engagement. Church bells rang in cities from Boston to Baltimore as Americans celebrated their first unqualified naval triumph of the war, while Perry's name became synonymous with American courage and determination on the Great Lakes frontier. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Lake Erie revealed the true human cost of naval warfare. As Perry's sailors worked tirelessly to tend the wounded and repair their battered vessels, the Lawrence, Perry's original flagship, presented a heartbreaking scene of destruction. Her decks, once gleaming with fresh paint and pride, were now stained with blood and littered with the debris of war. Of her crew of 103 men, 83 had been killed or wounded, a casualty rate that spoke to both the ferocity of British resistance and the courage of American sailors who had fought on despite overwhelming fire. Perry himself moved among the wounded, offering words of comfort and ensuring that both American and British casualties received the best care his limited medical resources could provide. Captain Robert Heriot Barclay's condition reflected the desperate nature of the British defense. The veteran Royal Navy officer had been wounded multiple times during the engagement, his remaining arm shattered by American grape shot, yet he had continued to command his squadron until the moment of surrender. Perry's treatment of the captured British commander would become legendary. Not only did he refuse Barclay's sword, but he insisted that the British captain retain his personal cabin aboard the Detroit and receive proper medical attention from American surgeons. This display of magnanimity impressed both fleets and would be remembered long after the war's end. As an example of honor between enemies, the technical aftermath of the battle provided valuable lessons for naval warfare on the Great Lakes. Perry's victory had been achieved through a combination of superior short-range firepower, tactical innovation, and sheer determination, but it had also revealed significant problems with American naval communication and coordination. The failure of some American ships to fully engage during the battle's crucial phase had nearly resulted in defeat, and Perry would spend considerable time in post-battle reports analyzing what had gone wrong and how similar problems could be prevented in future engagements. These lessons would prove invaluable as the war continued. The strategic consequences of Perry's triumph began manifesting almost immediately. Within days of receiving Perry's famous dispatch, General William Henry Harrison began preparing his army for the invasion of Canada and the recapture of Detroit. British General Henry Proctor, commanding the frontier forces, found himself in an impossible position. With no naval support, his supply lines severed, and his Native American allies beginning to waver, he would be forced to abandon Detroit and retreat deeper into Canada. The entire British defensive strategy in the Northwest Territory collapsed like a house of cards, all because of 4 hours of fighting on Lake Erie's waters. Perry's personal transformation from promising young officer to national hero occurred with breathtaking speed. Newspapers across the United States trumpeted his victory in headlines that grew larger and more elaborate with each edition. Perry's glorious victory proclaimed the National Intelligencer, while other publications compared him to naval heroes of the Revolution and ancient times. At 27 years old, he had achieved something that seasoned admirals had thought impossible: the complete destruction of a British naval squadron. His calm demeanor under fire, his audacious transfer between ships during battle, and his chivalrous treatment of defeated enemies created a legend that would endure long after the cannons fell silent. The Battle of Lake Erie also elevated the entire concept of American naval power to new heights. Prior to Perry's victory, many Europeans had dismissed the United States Navy as a collection of frigates that might occasionally trouble British commerce but could never threaten the Royal Navy's command of the seas. The complete surrender of Barclay's squadron proved that American naval forces, properly led and equipped, could defeat the world's premier naval power in decisive battle. This psychological victory was as important as the strategic one. It gave Americans confidence in their ability to defend their waters and project power beyond their shores. The young republic had announced its rival as a serious naval power, and the reverberations would be felt from London to the Mediterranean as other nations reassessed their relationships with the growing American giant. The long-term consequences of Perry's victory at Lake Erie rippled outward from that September afternoon, like waves from a stone dropped in still water, ultimately reshaping the entire War of 1812 and America's position in the world. Within weeks of the battle, General William Henry Harrison had embarked his Army of the Northwest aboard Perry's captured British vessels and American ships, using control of Lake Erie to transport his forces directly to the Canadian shore. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. British ships, flying American colors, now carried the army that would drive British forces from the Northwest Territory they had occupied since the war's beginning. The psychological impact of an entire British squadron surrendering to American forces reverberated throughout the British Empire and across Europe, where nations closely monitored this unexpected conflict between Britain and her former colonies. The Royal Navy, supreme on the world's oceans for generations, had suffered an unthinkable defeat at the hands of what many British officers had dismissed as amateur colonials. This victory, combined with single-ship triumphs by the Constitution, United States, and other American frigates, forced the British Admiralty to completely revise their estimates of American naval capabilities and devote substantially more resources to the North American conflict. Perry's tactical innovations during the battle became standard doctrine for Great Lakes naval warfare throughout the remainder of the conflict. His decision to abandon traditional line of battle tactics in favor of concentrated attack at close range maximized the advantages of American short-range armament, while minimizing British long-range gun superiority. Naval academies would study his bold transfer from the damaged Lawrence to the fresh Niagara as an example of leadership under fire, while his breakthrough of the British line became a textbook example of decisive tactical maneuver. Future Great Lakes commanders on both sides incorporated lessons learned from Perry's victory into their own battle plans. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate theater of operations. With Lake Erie under American control, the British were forced to abandon their entire defensive strategy in the Northwest Territory. Detroit fell without a shot being fired, and General Proctor's retreat culminated in the Battle of the Thames, where American forces under Harrison decisively defeated the British Native American alliance and killed the famous Shawnee leader, Tecumseh. The collapse of British power in the region opened vast territories to American settlement and permanently shifted the balance of power on the continent's northern frontier. Perry's personal legacy transcended his military achievements to embody the spirit of American determination and innovation that characterized the young republic. His famous dispatch, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours," became one of the most quoted phrases in American military history, symbolizing the transformation of the United States from a collection of former colonies into a confident nation capable of defeating the world's greatest powers. Streets, ships, and even entire counties would be named in his honor, while his blue battle flag with its inscription "Don't give up the ship" became an enduring symbol of American naval tradition. The Battle of Lake Erie ultimately proved that the United States possessed not only the industrial capacity to build a world-class navy, but also the tactical skill and fighting spirit to use it effectively against the most experienced naval force in the world. Perry's victory demonstrated that American naval officers could match their British counterparts in seamanship, courage, and tactical innovation, while American sailors could stand toe-to-toe with Royal Navy crews in the furnace of battle. This lesson would prove invaluable in future conflicts as the United States grew from a regional power to a global one. On that fateful September day in 1813, when thunder rolled across the waters of Lake Erie and smoke obscured the horizon, 27-year-old Oliver Hazard Perry had not merely won a battle. He had announced America's arrival as a naval power that would, in time, command the very oceans that Britain had once ruled supreme. The echoes of those guns would resound through American history, a testament to courage, determination, and the price of freedom on the inland seas.